Welcome to Crime Story. Today, we bring you one of the most chilling and dramatic true crime stories that shocked the world, the Vallow Daybell Doomsday murders. This case is filled with betrayal, deception, and murder, an unthinkable tragedy that leaves us questioning how far one can go under the influence of a twisted belief system. A mother, her lover, and a radical religious ideology that led to the disappearance and deaths of two children, alongside the murders of two spouses. But what led them to commit such unspeakable acts? Was it the pull of a religious obsession? Greed for insurance money? Or was there something even darker at play? In the heart of this disturbing tale, Lori Vallow, a mother, and Chad Daybell, an apocalyptic author, formed an unlikely bond rooted in their shared visions of the end times. Their beliefs, however, didn't just stop at preparing for the apocalypse. They led them down a path of horror, leaving a trail of death and deception in their wake. As Lori's children, Tylee and J.J., vanished without a trace, a deeper, more sinister story began to unfold. The investigation into their disappearances quickly unraveled a disturbing web of lies, manipulation, and murder. The death of two spouses, the mysterious disappearance of two children, and the twisted ideology that justified it all. Each piece of this dark puzzle pushed the investigation closer to the truth. What motivated them to go so far? How could a mother be convinced to take the lives of her own children? Was it love? Was it the promise of a utopian afterlife? Or was there something more insidious beneath the surface? Today, we take a deep dive into one of the most tragic and shocking true crime stories of our time, the Vallow Daybell Doomsday murders. Stay with us as we unravel this chilling tale of family, faith, and murder. It all began in the fall of 2019, with the sudden and disturbing disappearance of Lori Vallow's two children, 16-year-old Tylee Ryan and 7-year-old Joshua Jackson J.J. Vallow. The first signs of trouble came when Tylee, a typical teenager with a bright future, was last seen on September 8, 2019, during a family trip to Yellowstone National Park. Her disappearance wasn't reported immediately, and to the outside world, it seemed like just another family vacation. But it wasn't. Something was terribly wrong. Days passed, and no one had heard from Tylee, and then J.J. disappeared too. The last confirmed sighting of J.J. was on September 22, 2019. A young boy with autism, J.J. had been part of Lori's world for years, and no one could understand how he had simply vanished without a trace. What was even more disturbing was Lori's response to the disappearance. She didn't immediately report them missing. In fact, she barely showed any concern. Instead of staying in Idaho to cooperate with authorities, she and her lover, Chad Daybell, packed their bags and fled to Hawaii. This was not the reaction of a mother in distress. It raised the first of many red flags. As the police began their investigation, the story only got stranger. Lori and Chad refused to cooperate. When asked about the children's whereabouts, they offered vague answers, making excuses and providing no concrete evidence or explanations for where Tylee and J.J. could be. This uncooperative behavior only fueled suspicions. What were they hiding? Why wouldn't they help the authorities find the children? The mystery deepened, and things didn't add up. The investigation soon revealed a chilling connection. Lori's ex-husband, Charles Vallow, had also mysteriously died earlier that year. Charles, a man who had been married to Lori for years, had been shot and killed by Lori's brother, Alex Cox, in what was claimed to be an act of self-defense. But was it? As the investigators started to dig deeper, they found strange inconsistencies. Charles had been concerned about his family's safety before his death, and he had made changes to his will, making it clear that he no longer trusted Lori. Did the deaths of both Lori's ex-husband and her children have something to do with each other? Or was it all just a tragic string of coincidences? The more the police uncovered, the more the pieces of the puzzle seemed to fit together in disturbing ways. Lori's increasingly erratic behavior, the disappearance of her children, the mysterious death of her ex-husband, it all pointed to something far darker than anyone could have imagined. Was this just a case of a mother caught up in a chaotic life, or was there something much more sinister at play? Just months before the shocking disappearance of Tylee and J.J., another dark chapter in the Daybell saga unfolded: the murder of Lori's ex-husband, Charles Vallow. On July 11, 2019, Charles was shot and killed by Lori's brother, Alex Cox, in what was initially presented as a case of self-defense. Alex claimed that he shot Charles after an altercation, but the circumstances surrounding Charles's death raised more questions than answers. Charles had become increasingly worried about the dangerous direction Lori's life was heading. He had been trying to confront her about her growing obsession with Chad Daybell, the man she would later marry, and the apocalyptic beliefs they shared. These beliefs were rapidly taking over Lori's life, leading her to make shocking decisions that no one in her family could understand. Charles, who had been married to Lori for years, was no stranger to her volatile behavior, but nothing prepared him for what was coming. Evidence emerged that Charles had grown fearful for his safety and the safety of his children. He had even gone so far as to change his life insurance policy, removing Lori as the beneficiary and replacing her with his sister, Kay Woodcock. This move wasn't a random act, it was a calculated attempt to protect his family and assets in case something happened. Charles was beginning to see Lori's behavior as a real threat, and he wasn't wrong. Days before his death, Charles had sent a desperate email to Chad Daybell's wife, Tammy, revealing the affair between Chad and Lori. He had clearly reached his breaking point, and he needed someone to know the truth. The email was his final cry for help, as he had started to realize that the woman he loved and had shared a life with was spiraling out of control. Despite the chilling context, Alex Cox's claim of self-defense was accepted, and no charges were pressed. But as the investigation into Charles's death was revisited months later, the details began to seem more and more suspicious. Charles's death didn't fit the typical pattern of a self-defense case. No one had fully considered how deeply Lori's beliefs and her growing relationship with Chad had affected her actions. Was Alex simply protecting his sister, or was there something more sinister at play? As the investigation into the children's disappearance intensified, the authorities began to see a disturbing pattern. Charles's death wasn't just an isolated incident, it seemed to be the first step in a series of dark events. The death of Lori's ex-husband, followed by the disappearance of her children and the subsequent murders of Chad's wife, Tammy, and others, painted a picture of a couple willing to eliminate anyone who stood in the way of their apocalyptic fantasies. The true nature of Charles's death was still clouded in mystery, but one thing became painfully clear: Lori and Chad's dangerous beliefs were not just leading them to separate themselves from reality, they were driving them to commit unspeakable acts. The death of Charles Vallow set the stage for the tragedies that would follow, and the investigation into his murder would soon intertwine with the search for Tylee and J.J., revealing a chilling connection between them all. Just weeks after the disappearance of Tylee and J.J., a new death rocked the case: Tammy Daybell, Chad's wife. On the surface, it seemed like another tragic and natural loss. Chad Daybell claimed that Tammy died from natural causes, but the circumstances surrounding her sudden and unexplained death raised red flags. At the time of her death, the public had no idea that there was anything more to the story. But in the dark corners of the investigation, there were whispers of something far more sinister. Only days before her death, Tammy had reported being shot at in her own driveway. A masked man fired at her with what appeared to be a paintball gun. Tammy was shaken, but she didn't immediately think of it as a serious threat. She was a mother of 5 and had lived a life relatively untouched by the horrors the world had to offer. The police, believing it was merely a prank, dismissed the shooting as nothing more than a bizarre and harmless incident. But when Tammy died just days later, the question remained: was this just an unfortunate coincidence? Or was it something more? The investigation into her death was initially shallow, as authorities believed it was simply a case of natural causes. However, As the investigation into the disappearance of Tylee and J.J. deepened, the investigators began to see troubling signs. Tammy's death needed a closer look. Why had Chad, seemingly unconcerned by his wife's passing, so quickly moved on and married Lori just weeks after her death? And why did Chad's behavior at the funeral seem so indifferent, even cold, compared to the grief that one would expect from a husband who had just lost his wife? It wasn't until months later, after the authorities exhumed Tammy's body, that the shocking truth was revealed. Tammy had not died from natural causes, as Chad had claimed. Instead, her cause of death was determined to be asphyxiation. Someone had intentionally strangled her. This discovery was nothing short of chilling. It was clear now that her death was not a tragic accident but part of a much darker plot. The authorities now had to consider the possibility that this was a deliberate murder, and the timing only added to the suspicion. Just weeks before Lori and Chad's marriage, Tammy was dead, and the pieces of the puzzle started to fall into place. With Tammy's death now confirmed as a murder, the investigation took a sharp turn. Chad, who had been a central figure in the growing Doomsday cult-like beliefs shared between him and Lori, was now linked to another death. His claim that Tammy's passing was simply a coincidence became harder to believe, especially given the mounting evidence suggesting a pattern of suspicious deaths surrounding him. The tragedy of Tammy's death was not an isolated incident. It was becoming clear that this was a case of calculated murder, with Lori and Chad at the center of it all. Tammy's death linked Chad to yet another crime, but it wasn't just her death that was troubling, it was the way everything seemed to connect. With the deaths of Lori's previous husband, Charles, the disappearance of her children, and now Tammy's murder, the authorities began to understand that they were dealing with something far darker than anyone had initially suspected. The case was no longer just about missing children, it was about a series of murders driven by twisted beliefs, greed, and a desperate desire for a new life, free from the obstacles of the past. The question that lingered now was clear: how many more people had to die before the truth was fully uncovered? And how far would Lori and Chad go to keep their dark secrets buried? The investigation was far from over, and the horrifying truth was just beginning to emerge. By early 2020, the investigation into the disappearance of Tylee and J.J. was beginning to take some truly shocking turns. For months, the authorities had been chasing false leads, piecing together lies and deceit as they tried to uncover the truth behind the children's vanishing. The couple at the center of it all, Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell, had been hiding a dark secret, and the world was about to learn just how horrifying their lies truly were. It wasn't until June 2020 that the authorities made the most chilling discovery: the remains of Tylee and J.J. were found buried on Chad Daybell's property in Rexburg, Idaho. The children, who had once been at the heart of the search efforts, were no longer just missing, they were victims of unspeakable acts. They had been buried in a pet cemetery on Chad's property, a location once thought to be reserved for their family's pets, but now a site where the bodies of two innocent children lay, hidden from the world. The condition of the remains was nothing short of horrifying. Tylee's body had been found in a state so unimaginable it sent shockwaves through the entire investigation. Her remains had been burned and dismembered, a grotesque and chilling act that made it nearly impossible to determine the exact cause of her death. The brutality of it was almost beyond comprehension. What kind of person could do this to a child? What dark motivations drove such an unspeakable act? J.J.'s remains were found under different circumstances but were equally heartbreaking. His body had been carefully wrapped in plastic and buried with rocks, a sad and strange contrast to Tylee's brutal end. The cause of J.J.'s death was quickly determined to be asphyxiation. Forensic experts believed he had been suffocated, likely using a plastic bag and duct tape, a horrific method that spoke to the calculated nature of his murder. Unlike Tylee, J.J.'s death had been executed with chilling precision, another sign that his life had been intentionally snuffed out by the very people who should have been protecting him. As the truth unfolded, it became painfully clear these were not just missing children. They were victims of cold-blooded murder. The discovery was a pivotal moment in the investigation, confirming what many had feared but could not fully comprehend: the children had been murdered by their own mother and her lover. The lies, the deceit, the endless questions, all of it had led to this grim and devastating conclusion. The chilling discovery of the children's remains painted a stark picture of just how deep Lori and Chad's twisted beliefs had sunk. What started as a seemingly normal family turned into a nightmare, fueled by extreme beliefs and a series of horrific decisions. The mystery was no longer just about the children's disappearance, it had evolved into a case of murder, manipulation, and betrayal. What had started as a quest for answers about two missing children had now become a search for justice for two innocent lives stolen by those they should have been able to trust the most. The discovery was only the beginning, and as the investigation continued, more horrifying truths would come to light. The arrests of Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell marked the beginning of the final chapter in one of the most disturbing true crime cases in recent history. It was February 20, 2020, when Lori was arrested in Hawaii, far from the scene of the horrific crimes she had committed. She was charged with desertion and failure to report the whereabouts of her children, Tylee and J.J. By the time the authorities caught up with her, the once hopeful mother had become the central figure in a dark and twisted story of manipulation, lies, and murder. Lori's arrest was just the beginning. As the investigation progressed, the police uncovered the chilling truth behind the disappearances of her children, and it wasn't just about the children. Lori and Chad were linked to the deaths of not just Tylee and J.J., but also of Chad's first wife, Tammy Daybell. Tammy's death, initially brushed aside as natural causes, had now been revealed to be part of a calculated series of murders. The discovery of the children's remains on Chad's property had already confirmed the worst, but the deeper investigation uncovered even more disturbing details. Chad was arrested in June 2020, shortly after the remains of the children were found, and the couple was charged with first-degree murder in connection with the deaths of Tylee, J.J., and Tammy. But what drove Lori and Chad to commit such horrific acts? What was the motive behind the cold-blooded murder of two innocent children and a wife? The prosecutors had a chilling theory. Lori and Chad's motivations appeared to stem from a dangerous mix of extreme religious beliefs and personal gain. Both were deeply involved in apocalyptic ideologies, with Chad at the center of a Doomsday cult-like group. They believed that they were chosen to play pivotal roles in the end times, and in their eyes, those who stood in the way of their so-called mission, whether it be spouses, children, or anyone else, had to be eliminated. But it wasn't just about the end of the world for them. It was also about removing obstacles that stood in the way of their relationship and their twisted vision for the future. The prosecution argued that Lori and Chad had conspired to murder Tylee and J.J. not just to fulfill their apocalyptic fantasies, but also to collect the life insurance money and social security benefits that the children were entitled to. The murder of Tammy Daybell was seen as another step in their plot. By killing her, they removed Chad's first wife, paving the way for Chad and Lori to marry. It became clear that, in their minds, these killings were justified by their warped religious beliefs, which allowed them to rationalize the murders as a necessary step to bring about their vision of the apocalypse. This twisted combination of belief, love, and greed made the motive behind these murders even more chilling. It wasn't just that Lori and Chad wanted to be together. They believed that by eliminating those who got in their way, they were somehow helping to bring about the end of the world, a fate they believed was preordained. They were driven by a sense of divine purpose, but their actions were grounded in one of the darkest forms of manipulation and cold-blooded calculation. As the case unfolded, it became clear that the couple's belief system had been the driving force behind their horrific crimes. They had used their radical religious ideology as a cover to commit murder, justifying their actions as part of a higher calling. But for the victims Tylee, J.J., and Tammy, their deaths were nothing more than a tragic result of a deeply disturbed and dangerous pair, whose twisted beliefs led them down a path of destruction. The arrests of Lori and Chad didn't just mark the end of their reign of terror, it was the beginning of a long legal battle. But the questions about their motives, the lengths they went to in their pursuit of a twisted destiny, and the lives they destroyed along the way would continue to haunt the case, leaving a legacy of horror that would be felt by their victims' families for years to come. The long-awaited trial finally began, and the world watched with bated breath as the fate of Lori Vallow and Chad Daybell was decided. After months of shocking revelations and an investigation that seemed to uncover more horrors with each passing day, the trial was the final chapter in this disturbing saga. In May 2023, Lori Vallow was found guilty of all charges related to the murders of her children, Tylee and J.J., and her former husband, Daybell. Her sentence was swift and final: life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the gavel came down, there was no relief for the victims' families, no moment of catharsis, only the painful realization that justice had been served, but the damage was irreversible. Tylee, J.J., and Tammy could not be brought back, and the heart-wrenching trauma left behind by their senseless deaths would haunt their loved ones for the rest of their lives. Chad Daybell's trial followed, and in 2024, he too was found guilty of all charges, sentenced to death. His fate was sealed, a stark end to the life he had chosen to lead, one filled with apocalyptic visions and a murderous agenda. As the case drew to a close, many questions remained unanswered. How could a mother, someone who should have protected her children, become convinced that killing them was the right thing to do? What twisted belief system had she and Chad embraced that led them down such a destructive path? And perhaps the most chilling question of all, how could someone as seemingly ordinary as Chad Daybell become the leader of a cult-like following, leading others to commit murder in the name of a world-ending prophecy? The answers to these questions may never fully come to light. Was it the power of extreme religious beliefs that clouded their judgment, or was it something darker? Was it the insatiable desire for control, or perhaps a mixture of both? The motives behind the murders may never be entirely clear, but what remains undeniable is the tragic, irreversible damage that was done. This case serves as a chilling reminder of the dangers of radical beliefs and the lengths some will go to when they become consumed by them. It is a stark warning about how easily people can be manipulated by charismatic leaders and how destructive a blind adherence to an apocalyptic ideology can be. The story of Lori and Chad is not just a story of murder, it is a story of the powerful forces of belief, manipulation, and control. The lasting impact of this case will echo for generations, not just for the families who lost so much, but for society as a whole. It forces us to confront the terrifying reality that belief, whether in a religious doctrine, a charismatic leader, or an apocalyptic vision, can lead to unimaginable horrors when unchecked. And in the end, the most tragic lesson of all is that some people, no matter how extraordinary their beliefs, are capable of making the most horrific of choices.